I'm Robert Prince, and my colleague is Sanette Steyn. We're both from the Center for Educational Assessments in CHED. Today we're going to talk about, essentially talk about the NBT diagnostic information that is part of the Know Your Students, Know Your Course report, which the DAS, Data Analytics for Student Success project has been working on. And I think the report is quite an extensive report with lots of important information. But we're going to try and deal with some of it, not everything with it, but try and look at particularly how it informs the teaching and learning of particular courses. And that's what we're going to do today. So Sanette, do you want to change the slide? Sanette, next slide. Yeah. So this one, yes. So the Data Analytics for Student Success project team have recently launched an updated version of the Know Your Students, Know Your Course report. And this latest version of the report provides additional diagnostic information that can be used to inform teaching and learning, particularly. We will, in this webinar, aim to assist you to how to put this diagnostic information, specifically the NBT subdomain analysis and the NBT relative importance analysis, and we'll talk about what those two things are, into conversation with curricula. This session will be focused on using student profile information drawn from the diagnostic data as a basis for the development of curricular interventions and to change the curriculum itself. Or even start making lecturers and course conveners rethink their pedagogy. With the cohort profile as a starting point, we will try and engage with you about the new content in the Know Your Students, Know Your Course reports, using a couple of courses as cases. We hope that we can reflect on what we can learn about student needs of a particular cohort based on these artifacts and the implications for teaching and learning in those contexts. But we also hope that we will start stimulating discussions across the other courses that we can't obviously show every course as a case. But we hope we can bring those conversations into this particular webinar. Sanette, the next slide, please. I am of the opinion that the aim of assessments should be to facilitate teaching and make student learning possible. If it doesn't do that, if it doesn't actually facilitate learning and teaching, then it misses a huge opportunity in our case. So I would strongly urge us to think about assessments differently if we are not thinking of them as formative in nature. Next slide. Now, nationally, and it's interesting, the picture for UCT is not radically different to this picture, but nationally for a 3-year degree, these two tables, give us an indication. On the left-hand side, it indicates the dropouts, and the right-hand side, the graduations. And you can see that in 3 years, for 2009, only a quarter of students graduated in minimum time. This is certainly by no means the majority. 75% didn't graduate in minimum time. Nearly a quarter of them will drop out over 10 years. And even though 70-odd% will graduate over 10 years for a 3-year degree, so the reality is a quarter will graduate at minimum time, a quarter will never graduate, and a quarter will graduate in more than 3 years. That is the picture nationally. And at UCT, the picture isn't radically different, and that's worrying. And I think this is where we need to do something different. And I hope that the diagnostic information provided in these Know Your Students, Know Your Course reports will be an impetus for changing the nature of what we do in our courses. So next slide, please. So I want to say that the changes in the basic education and higher education situation obviously has implications for changes in student needs. And changes in student needs has got implications for changes in basic education, but in particular for higher education. So the challenges facing higher education in the post-COVID-19 South Africa will be manifold and will stem from a number of diverse factors. It may be tempting to focus solely on issues such as the financial implications for institutions, and that is important, but we need to think about the curriculum. So however, even before the pandemic struck, Formaniam and Tefera alerted us to the growing need for more responsive curricula. Our responsiveness as institutions and educators to the needs of our students is perhaps now more important than ever before. It is crucial that we investigate approaches that will enable us to understand the new needs of our students under the current circumstances. Next slide, please, Sanette. So understanding the student needs. Current curricula predominantly, not always, but predominantly cater to the needs of the average student and need to be redesigned to move away from this one-size-fits-all approach to take the needs and characteristics of the target group into account. Vygotsky's zone of proximal development and later reconceptualizations of it are useful frameworks to describe and understand the profile of our students and therefore their needs. So if we look at this visualization of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, you can see that a student on its path has things that they can do on their own right now. But then there are things just beyond that that they can do with some guidance. And lastly, that there are things they can't yet do no matter how much guidance you give them. So the focus is on this particular shaded region where diagnostic information can help us inform what kind of guidance we should be providing students to make sure that they are able to move towards the things they can do on their own, towards things they can do with some guidance, towards things they can't do yet. So that for me is quite an important part. And well, how do we get that diagnostic information? And this is where the Know Your Students, Know Your Course report is a valuable instrument to provide that information. Next slide, please. So let's connect the dots. Just having the data is not enough. We need to put this diagnostic information into conversation with the curriculum in order to make use of it. We have three types of data at our disposal, maybe more, but at least three. We've got historical data, we've got qualitative data, and we've got diagnostic data. Once we understand the cohort profile and how it relates to the context we are working on, we can make appropriate decisions regarding providing support to our students. So the data informs our curricula, which informs the support that we need to provide our students. Next slide, please. So what do we need to know? There are four things we need to know. Are there external factors or additional variables you need to take into account? Here we think particularly of demographic profile of the cohort, other variables which may be socioeconomic. What are the trends you can observe in the performance of this group? What do we know based on NSC performance? What do we know about their performance on the NBTs? What is the relationship between the NBT subdomains and this course? How do they compare to previous cohorts enrolled for this class? How do they compare to the cohorts at faculty, institutional, or even national level? And how does this cohort compare to previous years? Performance of the faculty institution, the national cohort. And then lastly, what are the known problem areas in this course? What are the pain points? What are the observations that you have made over time are things that we can need to think about. Next slide, please. Sanet's going to, Sanet, next slide, please.
It's not moving. There we go.
So that's going to take us through the Know Your Students, Know Your Course report, aspects of it, with a focus on saying, how does this inform the teaching and learning agenda? Sanet?
Thank you, Robert. So we'll be stopping for certain questions in between, and please feel free to just pop a note in the chat if you have anything that you'd like to add to the conversation. So this is a little bit more of an interactive component of it. So I don't know how many of you have had a chance to look at the report yet for your particular course, but you'll see that we have 5 pages of fairly dense information, but in a very easy to use format, we believe. So we can firstly look at, so this is in addition to that last point that Robert made about the observations that you've made about your course. So if you are a course convener or a lecturer within a course, you know certain things about that course, what the pain points are, what the typical hurdles are for students, etc. And in addition to that, you now have access to this type of information. So let's look at what you can actually get out of this report. So the first thing we want to highlight is that these couple of pages. We have some information on page 1, page 3, and page 5 that sort of summarize the demographic profile of your cohort and any other variables that are there. So you have, for example, a breakdown of the school deciles. You have the entrance categories and the redress categories of the cohort that is registered for your course at this moment. So the first part to show you the current cohort, that information, and then the second part where we have the achievement gaps show you a historical picture over the last 5 years. So that gives you some input from trends that have happened with this course, and those same types of profiles to see, what you might be able to tell from that. And then the last page gives you a little bit more information again about both historical data and some things about the current cohort. So you have here from previous courses where the students are coming from in terms of faculty at the top. So if you are presenting a course that has students is drawing students from different faculties, this gives you an indication of where they come from. And you also have some of the courses that typically the students enrolled for your course have also been enrolled for, and sort of the performance trends on those courses as well. So here I'd like to pose the first question. What are sort of the things that you think are important to notice in this part of the report, and what would you typically want to use this information for, if anything? So you're welcome to open your mic and make a comment, or you can add something in the chat and Robert will read it to us. Any ideas at this stage?
If I may, my name is Zagi. So when I received this, first of all, I really appreciate that you share this information with us. And so in my case, I'm in health sciences, and the kind of student that we get in first year are your high performers, across the board, generally speaking. Yeah. But I still want to know the kinds of environments that they're coming from, so that diversity is important to us. And it's something that we take into consideration because in everything that we do, we need to constantly remind ourselves that we have in our class because I mean, our class is made up of everybody. So it's students who are registered in the faculty. So their identity is just the fact that they're first year students. It doesn't matter if they're doing medicine or audiology. And so it's important then to understand the schooling background, the home environment, nationality is also something that I look at with interest. You know, because for us, we are in health sciences and our primary mandate should be to train for South Africa. So I'm always curious, you know, to know how many students are in our midst who are coming from the country and who are also coming from elsewhere. And then looking then at their performance is usually the next thing. And as I say, generally, you have your high performers, but you can see differences when you then look at specific programs, because then that's where you know one can pick up that okay, these students are registered for this degree and those students are registered for that particular degree. But even with that, because I particularly work with students of rural origin, so I'm keen to look at what they coming with, and also both in terms of their skills and also in terms of their demographic profile. Because I mean, what we know is that they face particular challenges. So for instance, if we're looking at what has happened now in the past 2 years, where access was through online learning mostly. So one expects that they will have challenges in using computers. And so one has to make those provisions to accommodate such students in a classroom setting, not necessarily in the classroom setting, but in a small group setting when we meet with the students.
Certainly. Thank you, Nsiki. And one area here on this this first part of the report that's also interesting is to look at the entrance categories. So to engage with how many of the students that are registered for your course are first-time entering students entering the undergraduate program and so on. So those are the types of information that you sort of want to know. Then I see that I think Kathy had a comment. Robert, could you read some of the chat input to us? Not sure if Robert's mic is working. So I see there were Carmelita raised the issue of students with learning challenges and disabilities, and then also the questions regarding first language and second language speakers. Those are all the types of information that we would like to have as well. So perhaps some of that we would want to work into the report in future. I'm sure Kende is taking notes of these comments and we'll be discussing that. But yeah, those are certainly things that are also important to be cognizant of. And yes, we will be sharing the slides of these things of the presentation. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. So then we'll move on to the next bit. The next part of the report gives us a little bit more information about the course history. Okay, so that gives us that overview of this moves from knowing your students more to knowing your course, giving us a bit of historical data on the performance of the course. So typical things that we would look at here is the 3-year median grade, our 3-year pass rate, and the score distribution for these past years. So typically something that we would want to notice here, and I don't know how often you will use a box and whisker plot, just to say that this divides the scores, spreads it over 5 different points. And we have our minimum score at the bottom, maximum score at the top, and then we have our first quartile. And in this case, for the 2021 group, that was just under 40. We have the median, which is where 50%, the where we divide the group into the lower half and the upper half. And then we have the third point, well, technically the fourth point, where the third quartile is, and then we have the maximum score. So as you can see for this particular course, and this is, we've used the MAM 1000W courses report as an example here, you see that an important sort of thing to notice here is that in 2022, 75% of the students, actually more than 75% of them, performed below the level that was the median in the previous year. So that's something that you might want to notice. What happened in 2021 that could have affected performance in that way? So lots of things to consider. Most important here would be, these are first year students. The 2021 intake group would have been in matric in 2020, and we all know that COVID had a huge effect in that year. So maybe perhaps that's not unexpected, but those are the typical trends that we would look at here. So what are the sort of the things that you would want to look at here and pay attention to? Is this type of information useful to you? And again, you are free to open up your mics and or add anything to the chat. Okay.
I suppose, Annette, what is interesting is if you look at the students in red,
Yes,
and how that has changed since 2017.
yes,
you know, it does seem that a fair amount of the students are lying in 2021 are lying in the red range, which are students in the 0 to 49 range. And, you know, that is very different to 2020 and
yes,
even 2019 as well.
yes.
So it's worth seeing the contrast between the different years.
Yeah, yeah. And if you look at the top, those score distributions for each of those years, you can see that pattern there also very clearly. The larger or taller bars there for the 2021 red ones at the beginning, which certainly would alert us to something happening there that we might want to look into further. Thank you for that comment, Robert. Okay, so let's move on perhaps to the next one. So then what we also have in the report is that breakdown, again, back to knowing our students, of performance trends, specifically now in terms of NSC performance and in terms of the NBT performance. So some of the things that we would typically look at here is, what are the trends we can observe in terms of that performance? Firstly, what can we see of their performance of the current cohort? So up here with the NSC, it's the two scores, average scores here is for this current cohort. And then we have a bit of historical information here to the side with graphs indicating sort of the pattern for the last couple of years. So for example, for this particular course, we can see that this particular sort of performance profile seems to be similar to previous years for this cohort. So compared to others, there doesn't seem to be any like serious differences in their final scores on English and mathematics. Then when we move down here with the NBTs, we have the top 3 donuts graphs. Those are just for the current cohort. And then at the bottom, we have for each one a similar indication of how these things compare to the previous years. So some of the typical things we might want to point out here is that it's at least 20% in each of these groups whether we're talking mathematics, quantitative literacy, or academic literacy, that are in the intermediate level. And in the QL for this particular group, we actually have quite a few that fell in the basic category. Now, remember, this is a mathematics courses example, so that might be significant to look at. And then when we look at performance, here we can see some shifts in the trends from one year to the next. So there was some stability in 2018, 2019, 2020, and remember those are for the 2019 intake. So those was the first years registered in that year. So they had written the NBT the year before. So when we look at the ones that sort of stand out here, 2021, these were the students enrolled in 2021, which meant they were writing the NBTs in the year in the 2020 year, when not everyone was writing the NBTs and there were quite a bit of disruptions. So we see here a fairly large component where we don't have stats there because not everyone wrote there. So typical things we would want to look at here is what the sort of shifts are in those performance trends. And what we also might want to do is compare this to other courses, for similar courses for other faculties. So if you're working with a course that is subject specific, say a mathematics course that's for a particular discipline, it might be interesting for you to look at some of the other maths courses, know your student, know your course stats, to see how the picture may be changing or might be different for different groups. And also you could look at comparing this to the overall faculty scores or institutional scores, if we look at those level reports, or even looking at the national picture to get a sense of how your cohort compares to those other groupings. Then we can move on to the part that is new to the report. So the other parts were in the report that was available in the first semester. This page 4 is a new addition to the report, and it has just been launched this semester. And this gives us a little bit more insight into what those, if we break those NBT results down, what's going on in there. So we have 2 bits that have been added: the NBT subdomain analyses and the relative importance analysis. The first is our box and whisker plots that compare the cohort's performance. So this is the cohort that has now entered this course. They are currently enrolled for it, and this is their profile. So you can see the typical trends there. Things that we tend to look at when we look at this type of breakdown specifically is where are the subdomains that have the widest ranges. So for academic literacy, for example, we would look at discourse, grammar and text relations, syntax, text genre, and metaphorical expression as being the ones with the widest range of scores. And then the other thing we look at that's perhaps more important is where the medians are. So we can see here that medians are fairly high for most of the subdomains, but we have one standout here in the form of text genre with a slightly lower median. So that might be an area that we would want to look at. And you do a similar thing for each of the subdomains and see where those trends are. So here the question would be, what do I need to do now with this information? How would I put this into perspective in terms of my course, what I know about my course? So any comments at this stage? Would this be useful information? What would you like to use it for? And what are the things that you would need in order to use this?
Hi, Sanette.
Yes.
Siobhan, also from Health Sciences.
Yes.
And I'm at the opposite end to Nsiki. She's in sort of first and second year, and I'm in the later clinical years.
Yes.
And I found it really interesting that at a fifth year level course, there was still the predominant thing impacting on performance was academic literacy. But I found that I struggled to understand what the definitions of these different domains actually meant. And if I don't understand that, then I don't know how to fix it. Not to say that I can necessarily fix any of it. So, you know, grammar is easy enough, but something like one of the big ones that was playing out in our course was disclosure. And I don't even think that was in the definitions. So I almost feel like we should have separate sessions just to look at what they actually mean, because I don't know how to make use of them at the moment.
So the disclosure one specifically, that's discourse discourse relations, and they, for example, in your context in the medical faculty, that would be what we would assess in the NBTs would typically be the ability to understand the structure of an argument and know what is the main idea, and what are the supporting ideas. So understanding sort of almost like the building blocks of the argument, and being able to name it as such, are things that go into that particular area. Now, how this translates into a particular context within medicine, that might mean that when they are dealing with texts on their own in the textbook, that if they are struggling with that particular one, they might not be able to pick up on those relationships if they are dealing with that type of content on their own.
I think I think if that's what that particular domain means, I think that's got huge implications for clinical reasoning.
Yes,
because
definitely.
Obviously, you have to kind of argue with yourself and decide what your differential is.
Yes.
So that's useful to understand. Thank you.
And certainly we would be happy to do sessions that are more discipline specific, and we actually invite you to engage with us on that. We have done similar work for other courses, so please, we are happy to engage with you further and try and grapple with what it means for a specific course. But yeah, it's also useful to see what the things are that sort of pop up regardless of which discipline or faculty or even institution we're looking at. Things like text genre, which we see in this particular example. If I'm just going to go back before the question was added to the thing. Text genre and metaphor and vocabulary are often pop up as particular problem areas. But text genre, almost no matter which faculty discipline we're talking to, or which institutions data we're looking at, students seem to have a problem there. So that's signaling a systemic issue, most likely, of not being exposed to those types of thinking in the school curriculum, or not being made aware of the fact that they are dealing with those particular things. So, you know, trying to relate text genre to, say, mathematics could be quite challenging, but that is some of the types of things that we could explore. Typically, for this particular example, I would say that text genre in that context, that has to do with the understanding of the overall purpose of a text, the gist of a text, and also the intention of an author, and what so being able to pick up on underlying agendas that an author might have, or their opinion about a certain thing, their stance. Those types of things are typically tested in text genre. So, for one course, this might pop up in one way, and for a different discipline, it might be totally different. Okay, so then we know now the sort of the trends for the
Sorry,
cohort.
Sunette, we have a question. Somebody's hands up.
Yes.
Tiki.
Go ahead, yeah.
Thanks, Annette. I just wanted to say that I think for health sciences, we probably will need to sit in one room and look at the progression of a particular student.
Yes.
I mean, considering the demographic profile. Because, I mean, if we're talking about clinical reasoning that is linked to academic literacy, one would want to understand what is happening in first year, what is happening in second year, and what happens when they get to fourth, fifth, and sixth year. What are the implications of, you know, their background knowledge, and what has been the influence of the academic institution in how, you know, that learning is facilitated?
Certainly, and yeah, no, definitely that's a conversation to be had. And you know, perhaps I know that there are QL interventions in place in health sciences, but perhaps we need to look at what the provisions are for academic literacy support. You know, what, how are they accessing that, etc. So yeah, those are the types of things that you that we would need to look at. I see there are comments in the thank you. Thanks, Celeste, for your comments. Yeah, so definitely we would be open to having that conversation. And with any other group that's present here, we are planning to be open to having similar presentations with a more subject specific aim. So please contact us if you want to have that type of discussion. So let's move to the second part that we have added to the report, and that is the relative importance analysis. Just to give you a little bit of information about this, this is a multiple linear regression analysis, and basically what it does is compare the performance on particular subdomains to performance on in terms of the final course grade, and try to map out what the subdomains are that seem to be explaining the variations in performance in a sort of most sort of deepest way. So we have those that seem to have the highest relative importance at the top, so they have the longest bars. And so for this mathematics one, perhaps not very unexpected, this is the mainstream mathematics course, and the mathematics subdomains are all at the top, followed by some of the quantitative literacy things, and we then start to see some academic literacy things popping up. What is perhaps important to mention here is for this particular course, we've also done breakdowns in terms of score groups, in terms of score ranges within the group. So we've looked at those who have scored for the final course grade between 0 to 39 and between 40 and 49, etc. And what is very interesting is that when we subdivide the entire cohort into groups according to those score ranges, this picture changes. So it seems to suggest that there are, for certain groups within the courses, the impact of some of performance on these subdomains might be what's contributing most to the performance that they are have on the overall score. So, for example, in that group right on the cusp, the one between 40 and 49, the academic literacy and quantitative literacy subdomains are popping up very high, and there's actually an academic literacy subdomain that shows the highest relative importance in that analysis. So these are the types of things that you might want to explore as well. But what's important to mention here is that just because the subdomain comes out in terms of highest relative importance doesn't necessarily mean that that subdomain is present in your course in that format. it could be also a proxy for a type of thinking. So, for example, if we're looking at the results for philosophy, and geometric reasoning happen to be have a very high relative importance in a first-year philosophy course. There's no geometric reasoning actually part of the course. But when you think of the type of thing that you need to do in unpacking evidence, making the right inferences, and then applying it to your argument, that type of argument building that's present in geometric reasoning in mathematics, that's very similar to some of the things that's actually required in the philosophy course. So these are the types of things we need to think about in terms of trying to put these results into conversation with our curriculum. So what are the types of things that you would want to look at for your particular context here? Maybe we've mentioned some of it already, but are there any other things that you'd like to raise?
Sanette, it's Siobhan again.
Yes.
I have a question slightly outside of what you're asking, and you must tell me if it's not relevant or appropriate, but I'm really interested in how on earth do you arrive at this graph? How do you extrapolate, like what is it in the student's performance that tells you that it's this issue or that issue?
Yeah. So perhaps, Robert, you can explain a little bit more about the multiple linear regression that we use this. So this is just a statistical relationship that we then have to go into the qualitative analysis to try and understand. But Robert, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about this.
Thank you, Sanette, and thank you, Siobhan, for the question. I think that's an important question. So what we do here is we look at performance over 3 years in a course, in this particular case, MAM 1000W. And we look at the subdomain scores, how students performed on the individual subdomains. And we run a multiple linear regression between the subdomain scores as predictors with the final year score in the course as a target. And then obviously what we do is we ask which predictors are contributing the most. And that is where we get to the stack bars that we have here. And that tells us that in this particular case, the math functions and graphs are the one that is actually contributing the most in explaining the variation in performance in the math scores, and the next one, and so on. So it's quite important to know that there's a relationship between the subdomain scores and the overall score in the course. But what you want to know is which one is going to predict the most, which one is going to explain the most. Because for teaching and learning purposes, if you know which one explains the most, as Annette says, you can either see the direct relationship between the subdomain scores and the course itself, or you can look at are there proxies embedded in the subdomains that explains performance in the course as a whole. Yeah. So that's the approach we have embarked on in this particular case. And we found it very useful where we've applied it. So concretely, we've applied it particularly in mathematics, in economics, in physics, where we've really had people engaging with us with their material, with their causes, so that we can actually say, in this case, you can see how the subdomain is actually playing out concretely, and how you can make sense of that for changing your pedagogy.
Yeah. So we've actually, to tag on to what Robert just said, for one of the physics courses, I forget which one, we've actually run a relative importance analysis on results of a particular test in the semester. So there were 2 tests in the semester, and we ran relative importance in terms of that score based on their performance on the NBTs as well. And there we also saw differences in how that played out. And when we talked to the lecturer, it actually was quite apparent that the actual structure of the assessment was from the one test to the other was very different. The demands and the types of skills that were involved in completing the tasks in the one test were very different from those in the other test. And that seemed to be explaining also why we were seeing different relationships playing out there. One thing I do want to mention here is that when looking at this, it's important to then consider again what you see in your trends. So if these are the trends over the past 3 years, and we see these types of things in our subdomain analysis, we see here that geometric reasoning, for example, had the lowest median in here, and we see that there's quite a wide range of scores for change in rates. If we then go back to the relative importance and we go and see what's going on here, we can see that they are coming up fairly high in the relative importance. So those are some of the other things we want to consider. What do I know based on the performance of the cohort in that particular subdomain, and does that mean that I have more cause for concern perhaps, or more reason to pay attention to a particular subdomain and how it plays out? And that for that we sort of look to this type of analysis to see, okay, to what extent is it explaining some variation in my course? Yes. Okay, so I think we should move on because we're going to look at another example of this as well. So if the PowerPoint decides to work with me again, there we go. Okay, so we want to sort of look at utilizing this report now in practice. So the typical things that we would first do is look at our observations that we've made over time about these students engaging with a particular course, or if your context is different, if you're working with some sort of support structure, then you're looking at what you've noticed from your interaction with students, or what your provision of support to them. And from that, you have a sense of where sort of the pain points are. So what you typically do is look at what types of course artifacts, for example, do I have? What are the things I need to take into account when looking at those artifacts? You know, where are they coming from? What type of language is it using? What type of examples is present in my material, and how, to what extent can students relate to those things? How well do my assessments map to the type of typical exercises that I do with them in class? So you know, where sort of do my assessments fit into to that particular aspect of it? And to what extent do I rely on students to deal with, say, large amounts of content on their own as self-study, and then in the classroom setting, we're doing more of a seminar style? Perhaps that means that, for example, for psychology, there's a lot of emphasis on doing the reading yourself and grappling with those concepts, so that when they get to the classroom, it's the discussion is there. But that does also mean you're assuming that they were able to deal with that content on their own, and that they can contribute to that conversation in the classroom setting. So there are things that you need to take into account. I see there are a couple of comments. Yes. So
we've got about 5 minutes left. So
okay,
we won't be able to look at the case, but we will be able to look at those questions.
Yeah, so I'll just quickly go through. So we deal with those observations. We would look at specific parts of the the report to get certain trends, certain information from it. And then the questions become, you know, how do I use this information? What type of support does this suggest I need to add? Is it something within the curriculum that I need to change? Do I need to add additional resources, or do I need to look to support structures to provide support external to a course or a particular program? And then you need to grapple with questions like, how feasible is it to implement this? And are there other units and departments that I will need to work with in order to do this? So perhaps we'll move to the next question and open the next slide, open that up for discussion, and we can briefly discuss some of that. So then we get to some big questions. And the first one is, are we serving the students we admit? And if yes, if no, why not are we doing it in that way? So whatever your answer is there. And then secondly, if we look at the information about things like those achievement gaps that we see on the report, are there things that we need to be concerned about in terms of those gaps, and who needs to be part of that conversation, and how do we tackle those issues? So I think I should probably open this up to the floor now. Any comments, any burning questions that you want to put to the group? Please feel free to add your 2 cents here.
These are questions that are not specifically directed at you. I mean, these are questions which obviously we were grappling with when we were looking at these slides. And yeah. I think if you've got any questions that you would like to ask us, or comments that you'd like to make at this point in time, it will be quite useful to do so.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Celeste here.
Hi.
I think there's actually too much taken in 1 hour, and we have to grapple with a lot of these things. But for me, I'm thinking of the admittance of students, and obviously in terms of NBTs, and obviously I'm also in medicine. But yeah, for me, I just think, like you said earlier on, there's such a lot of systemic issues that we're seeing through this. You know, that happens depending on where people are schooling, etc. So yeah, it's challenging, and I don't know how much these kind of information can filter back through to the systemic issues almost of education of the students that we are admitting. I don't know. Maybe this is not the first forum to discuss this.
Perhaps I could just respond to that. There's sort of two parts to that. The first is that we need to find ways for this to work back into the basic education system, and we are trying to find different ways. We are brainstorming. But if you have any ideas or any platforms that you link back to those structures, then please involve us in those conversations. We would love to become a part of that, because we do strongly believe that there are things that need to be done at those levels in order to make sure that the right building blocks are there once they enter their system. But the second part is that this is the profile of the students that we have admitted, right? So they've jumped through all of the hoops, and they've been selected to study here. Now we have this information that maybe it was part of the structure that helped selecting, but we also have this information ready for us to try and grapple with. What are the things that we can do to try and support these students? So that first question about, are we serving the students we admit? We also need to look at, you know, what is it that we can do to help the students that have met all of our criteria for admission. But there are still certain areas that they need support in. But perhaps it does also spark conversation about how we are applying those criteria for admission. So, I mean, from one context to the other, there might be different things that we need to discuss, but certainly looking at the students we actually have in front of us, but also looking back to how we can feed back into the basic education structure is certainly very important. So thank you for that comment.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Thanks, Anet.
Okay, I see there's another comment in the chat. Oh, yeah, comment. Yeah. So any other things that you would like to add? I mean, as I said, we are very happy to do this for particular smaller groups with maybe a particular discipline focus as well. So we invite you to contact us for that type of discussion. But perhaps there are some things that you still need some clarification on. You're welcome to ask your questions. But yeah.
Sanet, can I just say that I think that for me, the most important thing is what Nsiki was saying, in that we have to close the loop between the senior years and the junior years, because by the time you reach 5th year, 6th year, yes, there are things I can do to support your academic literacy, but this is actually something that we need to be supporting further on. And I know there is a lot of input on academic literacy in those early years. So I think that's the most important thing, is to get faculties and deaneries and courses at opposite ends of the spectrum to speak to each other, so that we can properly kind of scaffold them where appropriate.
Yeah, no, certainly. And I think the question is, what are the ways that we can make our students aware of their development in terms of those areas while they're busy with those earlier years, so that helps them by the time they become senior students. And I know, coming from a place where I used to teach on an academic literacy course, where when we surveyed senior students, they would say when they were in the course in their first year, they didn't realize how much of an impact this would have later on, and they wish they had paid more attention to it when they were busy with it in their first year, because now in 3rd year or 4th year, they really saw what they were actually supposed to sort of get from it. So yeah, no, there are definitely conversations to be had about how we provide this type of support to senior students as well, but perhaps bridging those gaps in between as part of the way we tackle our support provision throughout is something we need to discuss. Yes.
We're over 12 now.
Yes.
2 minutes after 12, and people obviously have to go to other meetings. So unless there's something burning that someone wants to ask or comment on, we may have to close. So we have to move towards closure. Is there any specific things to be added? If not, then can I sort of, Sanet, do you want to?
Yes. So from our side, thank you very much for attending today. I hope you found this helpful, and please feel free to contact us if you have any more questions or you would like to engage with us further. And then just to say that Kende's comment in the chat about being careful to make distinctions between causation and correlation is very important too. So in dealing with these statistics, those need to be part of our conversation, part of our thinking. So thank you very much from our side. Robert, if you have any comment?
No, just to say thank you for the opportunity to discuss something which we believe we need to be talking about, and that is how should our teaching and learning take into account the diagnostic information that is so available. And Kendi has done an enormous amount of work behind the scenes to make sure that it actually becomes part of the Know Your Students, Know Your Course reports. And these reports, I think, are just amazing. If they're not used, I think we're failing the students we have.
Missing out on a huge opportunity.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Hi, Kendi.
Hi, Sanet. Thank you for that, Sanet.
I'm glad. I hope that was sort of in line with what you guys had intended for the rest of the report as well. We thought it was quite important to highlight those bits as well.
Absolutely. I would have loved to have more of the second part of the presentation than the first was important, but I think it may have taken a little bit more time and we waited. We postponed it. I think the medical school is very much interested, and I'll have a conversation with Greg and maybe set something up separately for the medical school people who are really interested in this and see how it takes off from that side.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, Max, for being our,
thank you, Max.
our tech host. I think we can stop the recording now. And thank you for all of the hard work in creating this report. I really think we need to show this off. And thank you, Max, to you and your team for all of the work on the assault event side.
Thanks, Sanet. Thanks, Max. Bye, guys.
Bye.